Hello, my name is Mike Hurley and I'm with Asset Optimization Consultants. Today we're going to answer the question, what is RBI risk? This question is asked to me by many of our clients or prospective clients to understand how risk can be used in their inspection programs. In order to understand our topic, we need to answer three questions. How did we get to using risk for planning inspections and why? What is risk and how is it related to risk-based inspection or RBI? And finally, what is RBI risk? In order to understand why we use risk for inspection planning, we need to understand the fundamental drivers that take place in heavy industries like refining and chemical production, right? Reality is that there is business pressure to keep these plants running even beyond their design life. And in fact, some refineries are running well past their design lives. And the public and the government has an increasingly lowered appetite for accidents that cause harm to the public or harm to the employees within the sites. Therefore, the results are that the plants and the businesses are constantly trying to understand and manage risk between these two opposing drivers. Understanding the business drivers we previously talked about creates a dilemma for refineries and chemical plants trying to manage their mechanical integrity programs. Undermanaging the program results in unanticipated failures and can lead to high costs for repair and replacement. Over-inspecting assets result in a false sense of security, because really, if we do an inspection frequently, more frequently than it needs to, we don't gain any extra knowledge about the equipment's condition. And we cost ourselves more money in maintenance and inspection budgets. This squeeze on profits, either way, is why we are now beginning to use risk to help us plan our mechanical integrity tasks. Now that we know the reasons for why we are using risk to do our inspection planning, we need to look back at how we got to this point. Two fundamental concepts brought us here. One was corrosion management, which is reasonably defined as managing corrosion on equipment, which is but one damage mechanism of many. And the other is process safety management, which is generally regulations in countries around the world that mandate how we should perform our damage and corrosion management. So let's talk about corrosion management in a historical perspective. The American Petroleum Institute was established in 1919. Three codes, which are currently used and have been used for a long time in corrosion management, are API 510, first edition coming out in 1958, API 570, first edition coming out in 1993, and API 653, first edition coming out in 1989. API 510, as an example, devotes a large portion of its standard to remaining life assessment using large amounts of UT. Obviously, 1958 was way before OSHA process safety management came into being. The others, 570 and 653, 570 for piping, and 653 for API 650 tanks, also have large concentrations of the standard emphasizing remaining life assessment using large amounts of UT data. All three of the standards use maximum arbitrary intervals of somewhere between 5, 10, 15, and 20 years as the longest inspection interval that you can have for a particular type of equipment. These three inspection codes form the backbone of the U.S.'s corrosion management efforts. Europe is a little different. Generally, their corrosion management efforts are codified in pressure vessel regulations by country. Now that we know the history of how it was developed and the standards and regulations that helped it develop, we need to understand how it worked before we started using RISK. The corrosion control programs in most major plants before RISK had generally been achieved by developing an experience base for the type of damage mechanisms that might be occurring. Sometimes we only learned and developed that base by seeing the failure actually happen. We use time-based inspection codes that used arbitrary maximum frequencies and remaining life assessment to help us establish a real inspection frequency. Unfortunately, both those things led to reacting, sometimes late, to what we didn't anticipate was happening. Time-based inspections, as they were originally conceived, wanted to use large data sets, generally of UT data, from which we would glean where the corrosion was taking place, and in most instances, what the corrosion was. The problem with this is it takes, in some cases, a long time to incubate the damage mechanism, and we're taking the same data for everything, and that large data set becomes a real issue trying to analyze. A lot of time now, we don't have time to spend years studying something in order to develop an inspection frequency. At the same time we were doing this corrosion management, we were having incidents, and they were getting bigger. And some of the incidents that required process safety management started out with some examples like Flicksboro in 1974 in the United Kingdom. 28 employees were killed. 1976, Seveso, Italy, was a massive dioxin release. 17,000 inhabitants of the nearby village were exposed, and cattle were killed in order to keep it out of the food chain. 1980, Piper Alpha. That was 167 people. 1984, everybody remembers this one. Bhopal, India. Methyl isocyanate, a pesticide, killed at least 3,800 people. And not to mention the thing that started the OSHA PSM effort in the United States. 1989, Phillips Petroleum, Pasadena, Texas. 23 deaths, 132 injuries. And they continued. 1990, BASF in Cincinnati, Ohio, 2 deaths, 41 injured. It was a flammable explosion. 1991 in Sterlington, Louisiana, another flammable explosion with 8 deaths and 128 injuries. In a world of mass communications and getting news stories out on wires, this became unacceptable to the American public, and in many cases, the European public, and therefore the various governments had or felt they had to step in. Those large incidents were unacceptable by the public. In an age when news traveled around the world at the speed of sound, we wound up having or needing our governments to keep us safe. And therefore, the governments had to react. In the United States, OSHA, otherwise known as the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, established in 1970, by 1992 had created a standard for process safety management of highly hazardous chemicals. This was developed with certain industry partners giving input. The European Union started earlier. They started in 1982, and they produced a directive, 82501 EC, which is in reference to the Seveso disaster in Seveso, Italy in 1976. Obviously, the industry itself, which had promised to self-regulate, was not self-regulating fast enough. So the governments, being governments, did it for them. Once countries developed process safety management regulations, which have the effect of law, then industry had to do something. And the problem is that most of these regulations are performance-based and require you to do something. The something that they were doing, using the corrosion management that they had historically been doing, was not working. It was focused on large amounts of data and long hours of analysis with too few people and not enough resources. So we needed to do something else. That something else needed to be a prioritization scheme that could be used to help us manage the data and the resources. We therefore naturally turn to risk, which is the third question, or the second question that we need to answer in our discussion of this topic. What is risk? Risk, simply put, is probability or the likelihood of an event and the consequence of an event. It is cause and effect. We do it every day. When you cross a street against a traffic light, you're judging the risk of being run over as you try to get to the other side. There are many other examples of this, especially risk management. If you get a tire that's going low on your car, should I fill it up? Should I replace it? Should I get it repaired? Most of us will take the risk to fill it up and watch it for a while because we know that the consequence won't be that large, especially if it's a slow leak. So unconsciously every day, we're using this concept. Risk, as we've shown, generically is a simple concept. It's probability time consequence, right? But you have to realize that consequence has to come first. There is no probability without consequence. There are consequences without probabilities. So therefore, when determining risk, the first element you must determine is what the consequence is. Merriam-Webster defines it as something produced by a cause or necessarily following from a set of conditions. It is the effect in cause and effect, and examples from everyday life could be as serious as being hit by a bus, having a car accident, observing a fire or explosion, or even stumbling and dropping your ice cream cone on the ground. Now that we have defined consequence, what is probability and how do we define it? Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines it as the chance that a given event will occur. That event is the consequence we just defined. Therefore, conversely, it is the cause in our cause and effect. Examples are rolling of dice to get a predetermined outcome of, like, snake eyes. How many rolls did you get snake eyes on? Flipping a coin. How many times were you able to flip a coin and get heads to show up? And if we think about that car accident from the last slide, consequence, how often do you text and drive? Because we know texting and driving leads to the consequence of having the car accident. These are simple concepts, again, that we use every day. And we need to now figure out how to apply those to chemical plants, refineries, and mechanical integrity programs. In order to continue this discussion, we need to answer the question, why was risk-based inspection developed? And as we've shown over the video, the accidents kept happening with the traditional corrosion management methods. They were big ones, killing many people. The broad time-based approach uses a lot of data, and it wasn't working. So the industry companies decided, we've got to deal with this problem. The problem was that we had to use large data sets, which cost lots of money, and those same large data sets become an analysis nightmare. It's impossible for the short-handed personnel that we have to be able to analyze all of that large data set and come up with a reasonably quick answer on what to inspect and how often to do it. In order to finally answer the question, what is RBI risk? We have to first answer the last remaining question, which is, how was RBI developed and what was it based upon? API, the American Petroleum Institute, in 1993, took the lead on this and put a project together with a group of companies, otherwise known as a sponsor group, of which Amoco, Citgo, Exxon, Petro-Canada, Saudi Aramco, Texaco are a few of the examples. They put in and donated money to develop documentation around the methodology and requirements to be able to translate risk into the mechanical integrity workspace for chemical plants and refineries. In order to do this, we had to narrow the consequence definitions. As we saw, generically, consequence can be very, very bad, or as simple and mild as dropping my ice cream cone. But for this, we had to limit it to certain types of consequence that were defined around uncontrolled releases of highly hazardous chemicals. We also had to define probability narrowly. So that probability and those probability models that were built for damage mechanisms that caused damage to the pressure boundary equipment in refineries and chemical plants. That document holding those damage mechanisms is API 571. We didn't define or calculate risk for things like human error because there was really no way to define it, and there was an infinite number of possibilities of how a human could cause a problem in a refinery. So anything other than metallurgical damage mechanisms were not considered as part of the probability, and those were agreed upon. The models and the methodology and the requirements were all developed by this group's industry experience, and they were piloted at an actual facility on the Gulf Coast. After they had proven themselves to work, or the industry group believed they would work, the first draft of the API base resource document was published as a draft in 1999. Understanding all of the previous information that's been presented now allows us to answer the question, what is RBI risk? And that question is best answered in one of the API documents themselves, API 580, Risk-Based Inspection. RBI risk, by definition, API section 4.1.40 states, a risk assessment and management process that is focused on loss of containment due to material deterioration. These risks are managed primarily through equipment inspection. That's what it is, folks. It's a prioritization scheme to allow us to prioritize maintenance and inspection resources. It is not a risk scheme to define the absolute risk of loss of containment for a particular piece of equipment. It is more than just a risk assessment. It is part of a process as stated in the definition. That is what RBI Risk is. And currently, there are two documents. The first is API 580, Risk-Based Inspection, as mentioned earlier, which provides the requirements for the work process shown in the diagram. And API RP 581, Risk-Based Inspection Technology, which actually provides the techniques for calculating probability and consequence for the damage mechanisms that are considered in risk-based inspection. I hope that this has been informative for you and that understanding where we came from to answer this question was important. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact me, Mike Hurley, at Asset Optimization Consultants. Or you can get a contact card through our website and contact us that way. We would be happy to help you with any needs that you have or questions that you have. Thank you and have a good day.